Imagine standing at a stranger's funeral. No tears, no speeches, only the endless army of 8,000 silent clay warriors. Around you, the earth is soaked with fear and power. Beneath your feet lie the bones of 700,000 forgotten builders. And the air still carries the poison meant for anyone daring to disturb the emperor's rest. Here, immortality reeks of mercury, memory is nothing but dust, and greatness twists into eternal loneliness. This is not just a burial site, it is paranoia made into a city. Welcome to the funeral of the first emperor, where even death obeys a command, and the only witnesses are terracotta faces that stare through the centuries and speak louder in their silence than any words ever could. But before you get comfortable, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm really curious to see who has joined us. Now, settle in. We're about to begin. You stand at the entrance to the necropolis, the air thick with a silence so dense you can almost taste it. There is a peculiar chill, as if the ground beneath your feet remembers too much and chooses to say nothing. Around you, the world is held in an uneasy pause, one of those rare moments when history, for once, is not rushing anywhere at all. The first thing you notice is the dust. It settles on your shoes, on your clothes, even inside your nose, as if to remind you of how little you matter in a place like this. You might have read about this site in books or scrolled through a dozen dramatic documentaries about it late at night. But none of that prepares you for the heaviness here. It is not just as a burial ground. It is a vast, yawning mouth of the past, and you are just a morsel passing through. It is easy to forget here that the world outside even exists. There are no car horns, no blaring televisions, no children shrieking, only the faintest echo of the wind as it snakes its way through the ancient earthworks. If you concentrate, you can almost imagine the shuffle of distant feet, the muffled clang of tools, the quiet desperation of tens of thousands of workers who built this place, brick by dusty brick, under orders they did not dare question. You try to remember why you signed up for this. Was it curiosity? A desire to check one more thing off the list of wonders you are supposed to see before you die? Or maybe you just liked the idea of standing somewhere so old that even time itself has started to look the other way. In any case, here you are, one living thing amid a landscape designed to outlast the concept of living itself. You have been told that this site is one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in human history, that it holds secrets and treasures beyond counting. Yet what strikes you first is not the grandeur, but the crushing humility. You are one, standing on the edge of eternity, looking into a darkness that stretches backward for more years than you can reasonably imagine. You are standing where an emperor once planned to defeat death. How quaint. You glance at the guide. She looks bored in the way only those who have seen too much of the extraordinary can. She recites facts, names, and dates with the steady cadence of someone who has repeated them so often They have turned into a kind of prayer. You catch fragments. First Emperor, Unification, 3rd century before the Common Era, monumental scale. Her voice echoes off the cavernous walls, as if even sound struggles to linger here. It is hard to decide what is more unnerving, the knowledge that beneath your feet lie thousands of silent soldiers, or the realization that not a single one of them has moved in over 2,000 years. They wait, endlessly patient, for a call that will never come. You, on the other hand, cannot even decide whether you should have brought a warmer jacket. The path ahead slopes downward, a gentle invitation into the earth's memory. You are reminded, uncomfortably, of funerals you have attended, how the air changes, how people speak more softly, how every movement feels suddenly more significant. Here, the funeral is not for one person, but for an entire way of thinking. The belief that if you build something big enough, it will outlast your fears. As you walk, you imagine the emperor himself planning all of this, convinced that his legacy would be secure as long as he was surrounded by the right company. The right company, it turns out, consists of nearly 8,000 statues, and you wonder, did he ever consider simply making friends? It is, you think, a special kind of madness to imagine eternity and then try to mold it out of clay. You keep walking, your footsteps swallowed by the hush that reigns here. Each step feels less like progress and more like surrender. Surrender to the absurdity of it all, to the unshakable fact that you are just another shadow passing through a place that was never meant for the living. If there is one lesson to learn here, it is that silence can be engineered. It can be built layer upon layer until it forms the backdrop to an entire civilization's anxiety. The emperor is dead, but his silence is not. It is everywhere, and now it includes you. You pause at the threshold just before the descent into the main pit where the soldiers wait. You know, already, that they are not really waiting for you or anyone. They are simply holding their posts because that is what they were made to do. And so you stand, not for the last time, uncertain whether you are an intruder or just another piece of evidence that nothing lasts forever, except, perhaps, the need to pretend otherwise. There will be more to see, more to learn, and undoubtedly more to laugh at quietly under your breath as the ironies pile up. But for now, you are here at the edge of the world's greatest grave, and history has finally succeeded in making you feel very, very small. You step into the penumbra of the passageway, and the light, what little there is, grows muddy and reluctant. There is something about walking downward into the earth that makes you acutely aware of your pulse. The walls close in, not in a claustrophobic sense, but with the indifferent intimacy of a place that has been waiting for centuries. The tour guide, whose shoes have undoubtedly traced these steps 1,000 times, clicks ahead with the confidence of one who knows that nothing here will surprise her. You, on the other hand, are beginning to feel as though you are shrinking with every stride. It is here, in this unremarkable slant of stone and dirt, that you remember the number, not 100, Not 1,000, but approximately 8,000 silent figures rest just ahead. 8,000. It is not a number you can picture easily. You try to recall the last time you saw 8,000 of anything, possibly grains of rice, or maybe the number of emails in your spam folder. Certainly not human shaped statues, each the size of a grown man, each posed as if caught halfway between orders and oblivion. The air is cool but not fresh, a relic atmosphere of compacted centuries and stifled ambitions. Your guide, with her well practiced monotone, begins to dispense the details. The terracotta army was discovered in the year 1974 by farmers digging a well. The first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, commissioned the army to protect him in the afterlife. Her voice is almost as monotone as the statues themselves, which you have to admit is a remarkable achievement. You struggle to reconcile the dry facts with the reality around you. This is not just a collection of funerary objects. This is a testament to what happens when one man's anxiety is given unlimited resources and absolute power. The army is not here to conquer lands or defend borders. It exists to soothe the troubled dreams of an emperor, to whisper to his bones that he is still, somehow, in command. And you are just another spectator, drawn by the irresistible promise of secrets that are too old to care about your curiosity. Ahead, the passage opens into the first pit, and the sense of anticipation thickens. The darkness retreats slightly, exposing a vast sunken floor studded with the tops of helmeted heads. This is the moment the travel brochures talk about, the scene on every postcard. 8,000 soldiers, frozen mid March, locked in a posture of eternal readiness. There is something almost endearing in their discipline. They are still waiting for orders that will never come. You pause at the railing, joining the quiet congregation of visitors who stand with mouths slightly open, cameras hanging from their necks like forgotten amulets. Someone whispers a statistic. Each warrior is unique. Another person murmurs about how the weapons were real before being looted by history and eventually the local authorities. You glance at the guide, who is now explaining, with the enthusiasm of a tired librarian, that the pits are divided into different formations: infantry, cavalry, chariots, because even in the afterlife, bureaucracy is unavoidable. The sheer scale of it all is numbing. You try, unsuccessfully, to imagine what it must have been like to oversee this project. You picture the emperor surrounded by ministers who never said no, nodding in satisfaction as thousands of craftsmen molded soldier after soldier, day after day, year after year. Did anyone ever dare to ask if he was feeling all right? Did he ever have doubts? Or did he simply believe, with all the certainty of a man unchallenged, that this was the best use of everyone's time? You have the luxury of hindsight. You know that the Emperor's quest for immortality ended, predictably, in death. You know that his army, for all its numbers, could not fend off the centuries of dust and forgetfulness that would eventually swallow his name and his ambitions. Still, you have to admire the audacity. If you are going to be terrified of death, why not go all in? Why not fill your tomb with more soldiers than most kings ever commanded in life? You look again at the faces in the pit. Each one is indeed unique, or so the experts say. You wonder how many of the sculptors slipped in a friend's nose, or a rival's ears, or their own expression on a particularly bad day. It is a small act of rebellion, immortalized in clay, and you suspect it is the only trace some of those workers ever left behind. The guide is still talking, something about recent discoveries, about technology that can scan the statues without disturbing them. You half listen, half drift. The army has survived earthquakes, floods, the ambitions of treasure hunters, and the deadly attention of archaeologists armed with enthusiasm and insufficient caution. The statues are patient. They have no choice. You, on the other hand, feel your patience wearing thin as the facts pile up like offerings at a shrine. What is most striking is not the grandeur, but the repetition 8,000. 8,000. You count a few heads, realize the futility, and stop. The monotony is the point, perhaps. Death is not glamorous, it is a process, an industry. The emperor industrialized eternity, and you are here to watch the assembly line. You step back, feeling the urge to cough in the dust laden air. You are not sure whether you are overwhelmed or underwhelmed, perhaps both. Either way, you keep moving deeper into the underground, following the same path as countless others who came to gawk at a vision of immortality that turned out to be more tedious than terrifying. Somewhere behind you, the world continues. Up ahead, the soldiers wait, and you are left to wonder which of you is truly the more patient. You are told, with a tired flourish of the guide's hand, that Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of a unified China. It sounds majestic on paper, but the more you listen, the more you begin to see the cracks in the statue of greatness. For every tale of triumph and unification, there is a shadow, a story of anxiety, paranoia, and relentless control. The myth of the first emperor is not just about conquest, it is about the desperate lengths to which one man can go to keep the darkness at bay. You try to imagine him, the boy who became king at the age of 13, who, by the time he reached 38, had managed to consolidate warring states into a single empire, crushing opposition beneath his meticulously sandaled heel. There is something admirable about the sheer scope of his ambition, until you remember that ambition, in human hands, has a tendency to curdle. The guide, who probably once had dreams of being an actress, now performs for a captive audience of yawning tourists. She explains how Qin Shi Huang standardized the written script, the currency, the weights and measures, how he built roads that threaded the empire together. You can sense that she has recited these lines many times before, as if repetition can summon the ghost of the emperor into the room. Without the first emperor, she intones, China would not have become what it is today. But there are always two sides to every coin. even one forged for imperial taxes. The emperor, it turns out, was terrified of oblivion. He was obsessed with immortality, with the prospect of his name fading from history, his bones being gnawed to dust by time. It is hard not to find a certain kinship with him in this. Who among the living has not, at some moment, feared being forgotten? What separates you from him is not the fear itself, but the scale of the reaction. While your anxieties might lead to a hasty diary entry or a midnight snack, Qin Shi Huang's insecurities spawned mega projects, great walls, forbidden palaces, and, most famously, a necropolis so grand that it could have swallowed an entire city. You look around at the evidence 8,000 warriors, each crafted to stand sentinel against the nameless horrors of the afterlife. The guide tells you that it took over 700,000 workers to construct the emperor's mausoleum. 700,000. You cannot help but calculate the logistics. How many meals, how many pickaxes, how many tears, and muttered curses. 700,000 people pressed into the service of one man's terror of death. No one is quite sure how many of them survived the project. History has a way of keeping certain numbers conveniently vague. You begin to sense a strange irony lurking in the heart of all this grandeur. The emperor unified a continent-sized kingdom, yes, but only by breaking countless lives in the process. For every edict carved into stone, 100 lives were quietly erased. You wonder how many of the terracotta soldiers, each with their own face, their own posture, were modeled after real men who once labored here, perhaps hoping that, in some small way, they would endure beyond the grave. Somewhere behind you, a child asks whether the emperor was a good man. The guide hesitates. Her response is carefully neutral, the kind of answer you give when the truth is far too complicated for a school field trip. He was a great man, she says at last. You know this is not the same as being a good one. You let your eyes wander across the ranks of silent guardians. In the muted gloom, it is easy to pretend that the Emperor's spirit still lingers, brooding over his creation. Perhaps he is satisfied. More likely, he is disappointed. The afterlife, you suspect, has little use for armies and monuments. But humans persist in building them all the same. For a moment, you wonder what legacy you would leave, given the chance. Not an army, perhaps, but something smaller, an unfinished novel, a shoebox of letters, a handful of unreturned phone calls. You suspect your ambitions would not require 700,000 hands, just one or two loyal friends. The guide moves on, reciting the next act in this well-rehearsed tragedy. She describes the emperor's quest for elixirs of immortality, his experiments with mercury, the way his court was littered with alchemists and dreamers. You are reminded, with a shiver, that even the most powerful are ultimately undone by the very thing they seek to escape. You realize, standing here among thousands of clay faces, that the emperor was both more and less than the myth suggests. He was not a god, nor even a particularly happy man. He was simply human, terrified of oblivion and dangerously capable of turning that terror into reality. You look back one last time at the army assembled in his honor. They do not blink, they do not breathe. They have already outlasted the man they were meant to protect and will continue standing long after you have gone. It is, you suppose, the closest any of us come to immortality, a faint echo of ourselves, preserved in the dust, waiting for someone else to remember. You have always suspected that the pursuit of immortality comes with a bill that nobody can pay. Here, surrounded by the cold echo of footsteps on ancient earth, you discover just how expensive one man's dream of living forever can be. The guide tells you, with a faint note of pride or perhaps resignation, that nearly 700,000 workers were pressed into service to build the emperor's necropolis. 700,000. You imagine them as a single mass, a population larger than most cities you have ever visited, all bent to the will of a man whose most defining trait was his terror of the unknown. You can almost see them, laborers, artisans, engineers, slaves, criminals. The lines between these categories blur as you realize that under imperial command, everyone was equally disposable. Some worked in the darkness, carving out the great burial mound. Others spent their lives crafting the thousands of terracotta warriors, painting on mustaches, and threading armor from clay, knowing full well that no detail was too small for an emperor who feared oblivion. They worked through the heat, the cold, the endless monotony of days defined by someone else's anxiety. In the end, the necropolis belonged to the emperor. The exhaustion belonged to them. There is a cruel symmetry in how history records these efforts. The emperor's name is etched in chronicles and carved into stone, while the names of the 700,000 have slipped quietly into oblivion, the very fate their master so desperately tried to avoid. No plaque marks their sacrifice. No historian recites their deeds. They are the forgotten architects of another man's immortality. Your guide, sensing perhaps a drop in the group's energy, shares another fact, hoping to impress or at least distract. The burial mound at the heart of the necropolis rises almost as high as a modern office building. You imagine the logistics, the tons of earth moved by hand, the endless relay of baskets, the whispered complaints that no one dared voice too loudly. She tells you that the mound itself is a miniature of the empire, rivers, mountains, palaces, all reproduced in miniature within the tomb. The emperor wanted not just an army, but a world that would keep him company forever. You suspect he failed to consider that eternity, even with a good view, can be astonishingly dull. In the dim half-light, your attention drifts to the little things, the chipped fingers on a soldier's hand, the faded trace of pigment that once made a face come alive. You try to imagine the army as it was, shields bright with color, uniforms crisp and lifelike, weapons gleaming with the threat of eternal war. But color fades quickly in this world. Within days of being uncovered, the ancient pigments vanished, devoured by air and light. Even the most stubborn visions of immortality are no match for a change in the weather. You listen as the guide recounts a theory that when construction was complete, thousands of those who built the tomb were entombed themselves, buried alive, to ensure that no secrets escaped. You have no way of knowing whether this is truth or rumor. It hardly matters, since both serve the same purpose. They remind you that every miracle of ancient engineering is also a monument to human expendability. To build something that endures, something must be spent, and it is almost never the person who gives the order. As you walk deeper into the complex, you feel the price of immortality press in on you. You imagine the silent rows of craftsmen, each hoping, perhaps, to avoid the emperor's notice, or at least to see the sun rise one more time. You wonder how many prayed that, if their likeness was immortalized in clay, it would be in a place the emperor never bothered to visit. The guide gestures at a reconstructed scene, workers bent over wooden scaffolds, faces drawn with exhaustion, overseers lurking like shadows. It is meant to educate, to help you visualize the scale of effort. Instead, it depresses you. These people lived and died to build a fantasy, a comfort for a man who was never comforted, a fortress against a death that in the end could not be bribed or bullied into retreat. You notice the other tourists drifting, their attention waning as the facts accumulate like sediment. Someone jokes that 700,000 workers could have built a whole new city, perhaps even a better one. You smile, but the thought lingers. How much progress, how many lives, how many possible worlds were traded for the sake of a single mausoleum? Your guide, her voice now almost drowned out by the echo of your own thoughts, explains that the emperor's tomb remains unopened. There are rumors of rivers of mercury, of deadly traps, of treasures beyond imagination. Archaeologists hesitate, not for lack of curiosity, but out of fear that they will destroy what little remains, or worse, that they will find only proof that all the effort amounted to nothing. You find yourself wondering about the workers, those anonymous 700,000. Did any of them imagine, for even a moment, that what they built would survive for millennia? Did they believe the emperor's promises of favor in the afterlife? Or did they simply hope for a day when their hands would not ache and their stomachs would be full? Did they carve a piece of themselves into the statues? A nose, a smile, a frown, hoping for some accidental immortality of their own? You suspect the answer is lost, just like their names, buried beneath the weight of ambition and time. The emperor may have purchased his legend at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, but even legends cannot outrun oblivion forever. Someday, perhaps, even these silent soldiers will crumble, and their story will be just another layer in the earth. For now, though, the necropolis remains, a silent monument to a man who could not accept that all things end. You, standing here, are left with the uncomfortable certainty that immortality is not measured in years, but in the lives consumed along the way. You move on, ushered toward the next pit, past a forest of velvet ropes and gentle admonitions not to touch the ancient dust. It is here that you come face to face, or more accurately, face to countless faces, with the eternal guards, the terracotta warriors. In the half light, hundreds upon hundreds stand shoulder to shoulder, stretching into the gloom, an army of men who will never blink, never flinch, never sleep. At first glance, they blur together, a gray sea of stoicism and indistinct features. But as your eyes adjust, details sharpen. You see that each warrior is not quite like the next. A broader nose here, a softer jawline there, a twist in a mustache, a fold in a brow. You are told, once again, that no two are identical, as if the ancient craftsman had nothing better to do than to etch individuality into 8,000 sets of cheekbones and brows. Perhaps this was their small act of rebellion, or perhaps it was simply that making the same face all day would have driven anyone mad. The guide, sensing a teachable moment, launches into a litany of facts. Each soldier stands about as tall as a modern man, though some are a little taller or shorter, because apparently not even death could enforce true uniformity. The infantrymen, with their sturdy stances and simple armor, make up the bulk of the ranks. There are archers, frozen in poses of patient readiness. There are officers with slightly more elaborate hairstyles and longer robes. Even the horses have their own tired, noble expressions, as if they too realize this assignment is eternal. You cannot help but feel for them. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the same place for over 2,000 years, waiting for an order that will never come. You are supposed to admire the discipline, the unity, the majesty of an army prepared to serve its emperor in the afterlife. But what you really see is monotony, a post from which there is no retirement, no sleep, no escape. Their job description is simple: stand guard forever. No overtime, no hazard pay, just a permanent night shift in the world's quietest tomb. Someone in your group asks if the soldiers' weapons are real. The guide nods solemnly, explaining that they once held genuine bronze swords, spears, and crossbows, most of which have long since been stolen, rusted, or claimed by museum collections far from home. You wonder if the ancient weapons were ever meant to be functional, or if this, too, was just for show. One more layer of illusion in an afterlife constructed like a stage play. As you drift between the silent ranks, it strikes you how little separates the warriors from yourself. Both of you are here, after all, because someone else decided it was necessary. The difference is that you will get to leave at the end of the tour, to eat lunch, to answer emails, to forget about the army until you need an anecdote for a dinner party. They, meanwhile, will remain in the cold earth, forever performing their one assigned task, their existence defined entirely by the needs and fears of another. You find yourself lingering on the faces again. Some look defiant, others resigned. Some seem to smirk, as if sharing a private joke about the absurdity of eternity. You realize that each warrior, for all his individuality, is ultimately the same, a product of someone else's imagination, frozen in the act of obedience. Even their uniqueness is a kind of conformity, crafted to fill a ruler's vision of control. The guide shares another tidbit. The warriors were arranged in strict military formation, divided by rank and role. Here, even the afterlife is organized according to bureaucracy. You cannot help but smile at the thought. Eternity, it seems, is just another office with no windows, just more paperwork, just a stricter dress code. The emperor's vision of order did not stop at death. If anything, it became more obsessive. You picture the workers who sculpted these faces. Did they insert small traces of their friends, their rivals, themselves? Maybe a crooked grin from a cousin, a weary scowl from a foreman. Maybe, in crafting so many faces, they slipped in their own silent protests, an upturned eyebrow, a dimple, an expression of exhaustion. In a world where every other kind of defiance was crushed, perhaps this was the last safe rebellion. You try to imagine the emperor inspecting his clay army, pacing between rows, searching for imperfections. Was he pleased? Did he find comfort in the serried ranks, or did he see only the shadows of his own fear multiplied and made permanent in 1,000 expressions of loyalty? The longer you stand among the guards, the more you feel the weight of their task. Immortality is supposed to be a gift, but here it seems only another kind of sentence. The emperor's desire for safety, absolute, unceasing, all consuming, has created the most spectacular form of loneliness. The soldiers are surrounded by company, yet none can speak to another. They are a crowd, but each is alone. You begin to notice the marks of time on their surfaces, cracks, missing fingers, pitted cheeks. These, too, are evidence of centuries of patient waiting. The emperor's solution to mortality was not perfect. Even his most loyal guards have begun to crumble at the edges. Eventually, even the most vigilant sentry loses his battle with the elements. You step away from the front lines, glancing back at the sea of faces that do not move, do not judge, do not remember. You are struck, unexpectedly, by a sense of kinship. All of us, you think, are drafted into someone else's grand plan at one point or another, made to stand watch over dreams that are not our own. Some stand for years, others for a lifetime. These soldiers will stand for as long as the earth allows. The guide calls for the group to move on. As you leave, you cast one last look at the rows of warriors. You think, in the end, perhaps the greatest irony is that the most enduring legacy of the world's most powerful emperor is an army consigned to garden only dust and memory. You advance, nudged along by the guide's gentle insistence and the silent pressure of the crowd behind you. The deeper you descend into the necropolis, the more you are struck by the absurd meticulousness of it all. There is, you realize, a certain etiquette to eternity, a set of unwritten rules that govern both the dead and those who come to gawk at their arrangements. It is difficult to imagine who first decided that kings and emperors should be guarded in perpetuity, or why. Was there some original anxious monarch, long lost to the ages, who declared that mere burial was insufficient, that the afterlife required the same rigid ceremony as life, or did it simply become fashionable, as power often does, to outdo one's predecessors by going ever grander, ever deeper, ever more elaborate in one's fear of what lies beyond? The guide points out that the necropolis is not only a military installation, but an entire underworld bureaucracy. Each row, each pit, each formation was carefully mapped according to an invisible logic. Generals to the front, infantry behind, archers on the flanks. Even in death, hierarchy prevails. You imagine the emperor dictating plans to a retinue of architects and ministers, fussing over the optimal arrangement of his eternal entourage. There is a strange comfort, perhaps, in this bureaucratic order, a belief that if only one is sufficiently organized, sufficiently thorough, the unknown will yield to structure. You know this feeling, the urge to tidy your desk before an exam, to alphabetize your files in the face of existential dread. The emperor was simply operating on a larger scale, imposing a protocol of control onto eternity itself. You wonder about the architects, the planners, the endless stream of overseers who made this vision real. Did any of them ever question the point? Or did they, like so many before and since, simply do as they were told, translating the anxieties of the powerful into diagrams, inventories, and lists? The guide mentions that no detail was left to chance. Not only were the soldiers arranged by rank and file, but their gear was catalogued, their horses measured, even the chariots arrayed with painstaking precision. You cannot help but find this darkly amusing. Here, in the quiet dust of centuries, the emperor's quest for order is still visible. Even entropy must stand in line. The warriors have not moved an inch in over 2 millennia, but you can sense the phantom presence of inspectors and supervisors still patrolling the ranks in some bureaucratic afterlife. The guide, whose enthusiasm flickers with the force of well rehearsed routine, tells you about the endless records, clay tablets, wooden slips, and painted inscriptions listing the numbers and roles of every figure. You think of the poor scribe, hunched over his tally, squinting in the candlelight, wondering if he dared skip a name or miscount a horse. Did anyone really believe that paperwork could keep the emperor safe from whatever monsters haunted his imagination? There is something almost touching about this faith in protocol. It is not enough to command armies, or build walls, or conquer kingdoms. The emperor believed that death itself could be negotiated with, provided the arrangements were thorough enough. If you have enough guards, enough scribes, enough lists, perhaps you can keep the void at bay. You let your gaze drift across the ranks of silent warriors. The formation is so orderly that it feels choreographed, as if the emperor's last wish was to stage manage the afterlife into submission. You imagine the afterlife as a vast office staffed with soldiers instead of clerks, where paperwork is never lost and no one is ever late for their shift. But there is an edge to this order, a cost that is impossible to ignore. For every rule, there was an enforcer. For every protocol, a consequence. You have already heard rumors about those who built the tomb and what happened to them when their work was done. The emperor's fear of disorder extended not just to the afterlife, but to the world he left behind. Secrecy was enforced with silence, and silence with burial. As you walk, you pass displays of the original plans, maps rendered in ancient ink, blueprints that survived the centuries better than the men who drew them. You are struck by the thought that all of this, every row of soldiers, every regulation, was meant to be hidden. No one, least of all the emperor, expected you to be standing here, peering at the remains of his terror. The necropolis was not a display. It was a secret, a fortress whose primary defense was its own obscurity. Yet here you are, walking the same ground as countless visitors before you, armed with nothing more dangerous than a camera and a pamphlet. The Emperor's secrets are now public property, his protocols reduced to museum exhibits and bullet points for bored students. There is a peculiar irony in the way history treats its most fastidious record keepers. The harder they try to control the narrative, the more certain it is that the narrative will slip away, to be rewritten by strangers centuries later. Your group pauses at a glass case holding a single figure, an officer, distinguished by a slightly more elaborate cap and the faintest hint of a frown. The guide explains that even within the ranks of the dead, distinctions must be maintained. Status, it turns out, is as indestructible as terracotta. You step back, taking in the scale once more. 8,000 soldiers, each with a name once listed, each with a place in the great order of things. The emperor built his afterlife as a fortress of bureaucracy, a maze of rules and roles designed to keep chaos, and perhaps himself, forever at arm's length. You leave this part of the necropolis with a strange sense of deja vu. Protocol, it seems, is the true inheritance of empires. No matter how much time passes, someone, somewhere, will always be keeping a list, enforcing the rules, trying to organize eternity. You move onward, led by the gentle pressure of the group and the gravitational pull of curiosity. The path takes you closer to the warriors themselves, close enough, the guide warns, that you must not reach out and touch, lest centuries of dust leap eagerly from your skin to theirs, and history take on a fingerprint it was never meant to have. You are not trusted with the fragile skin of the past. Instead, you must settle for observation, for the illusion of proximity. Illusion, it turns out, is the heart of the necropolis. The soldiers, so solid and stoic in the half-light, are made entirely from clay, a material as humble as it is ancient, as easily shaped as the emperor's ambitions. You listen as the guide describes the process, how each figure began as coils and slabs, built up over a simple frame, the limbs cast in molds, and the heads sculpted by hand. The process was repetitive, industrial, almost mechanical, and yet the final result gives the impression of endless individuality. Here, assembly line monotony wears the mask of uniqueness. You stare at the hands, noticing the slight differences in grip and gesture. You inspect the seams where parts were joined, now faintly visible beneath faded paint and the slow abrasion of time. Each warrior is hollow, a shell of fired earth, yet somehow imposing. The illusion is so well maintained that you half expect one to turn its head, to blink, and regard you with the mild annoyance of a guard interrupted mid shift. It is hard not to be impressed by the logistics of the thing. To create 8,000 life size statues in a few decades would be a monumental task even today, with factories and automation at your disposal. For a civilization powered by hand tools and hard labor, it required not only effort, but a degree of centralized control bordering on the tyrannical. The emperor's vision was absolute, and so was his command of resources. You imagine teams of workers, sculptors, potters, apprentices, turning out soldier after soldier under the stern eyes of overseers who measured progress not in hours, but in faces completed. The guide points out that the warrior's armor was modeled after real military gear of the period, right down to the overlapping plates and elaborate knots. Yet what you see is more artifice than authenticity: clay straps and laces where there should be leather and silk, terracotta rivets where metal once held things together. The illusion is almost complete, but not quite. Up close, the fragility is obvious, and you realize that none of these soldiers would last a minute in a real battle. Their purpose is not to fight, but to comfort. You are told that when the army was first unearthed, the warriors were not the drab, dusty gray you see now. They were painted in vivid color: reds, blues, greens, even touches of gold, each face bright with artificial life. But exposure to air caused the pigments to flake and vanish within hours. In a cruel twist, the act of discovery became an act of erasure, the illusion spoiled by the very attention it was built to attract. You picture the original splendor, the eerie brightness of so many painted eyes staring out from the ground, and you mourn the loss of something you never saw. There are other illusions at play. The weapons once clutched in the warrior's hands were real, bronze and sharp edged, but most have been looted or corroded away. The chariots, reconstructed with painstaking precision, are mere shadows of the vehicles they once were. Even the horses, with their proud necks and flared nostrils, are immobilized by the earth, clay muscles straining against a weight they can never escape. You listen as the guide, voice lowered in reverence, describes how each face is unique, though scholars debate just how many truly different molds were used. Some say the craftsmen were ordered to make every soldier different. Others claim there were a limited number of templates with details added for variation. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between genius and expedience, between the desire to impress and the need to get the job done before someone lost patience. You let your mind wander to the workers themselves. Did they feel pride in their task? Did they see themselves as participants in history, or just cogs in a vast, grinding mechanism? You suspect the latter. The illusion, after all, is not just for the emperor. It is for everyone who comes after, everyone who stands where you now stand, marveling at the spectacle of power made permanent in mud. There is a moment as you walk the perimeter when you catch your reflection in the glass that separates you from the nearest warrior. For a second, your face and his are superimposed, and you are struck by the thought that all of us are made of the same fragile stuff, animated by purpose until the air finds us wanting. The difference is only in the story we leave behind. The guide continues, explaining that restoration is a slow and uncertain process. Every attempt to preserve the statues brings new risks. Some warriors are stabilized with modern chemicals, others left to crumble gently. The fight against decay is ongoing, a quiet war against the very forces the emperor sought to master. In the end, clay returns to earth, illusions fade, and even the most disciplined army can do nothing to hold back time. You leave this section with a newfound respect for the illusion, the careful, deliberate artifice that sustains the memory of empire. Clay soldiers and painted faces, armies that exist only to be seen. The emperor dreamed of protection, but what he built was theater, a spectacle that fools the eye and soothes the mind, at least for a while. As you move on, you realize that you too are part of the illusion. You have come in search of meaning, of grandeur, of a glimpse into the eternal, and you have found it, all of it crafted from the simplest of materials, held together by hope, fear, and the desire to be remembered. The further you walk, the heavier the hush becomes. You find yourself wondering whether the silence in this place is a natural feature, or whether it has been carefully cultivated, as much a part of the necropolis as the warriors themselves. The sound of footsteps is absorbed almost instantly by the earthen floor. Conversations become whispers, as if some ancient force expects you to show the same respect here that you would in a cathedral or a courtroom or a hospital waiting room at midnight. It is this silence, more than anything, that impresses itself upon you. 8,000 figures stand at attention, and not a single one makes a sound. Not the scrape of a heel, not the shifting of weight from foot to foot, not the clearing of a throat or a nervous cough. In the ranks of the terracotta army, silence is not just an absence, it is a presence, a participant in the drama of immortality. You realize that here, in this underworld garrison, it is not just the emperor who is surrounded by stillness, so are you. The guide draws your attention to the faces again. You examine them one by one, and you see that each seems to be lost in private thought. Some appear resolute, jaws set and brows furrowed, ready for a battle that will never come. Others look melancholy, their lips parted as if about to speak, but stopped by the weight of centuries. There are warriors who look amused, as if they share a joke that has survived dynasties, and others who seem almost afraid. It is a remarkable trick, this illusion of interior life, painted onto the surface of clay. You wonder how much of this was intentional and how much was an accident, a byproduct of the craftsman's boredom or defiance. Did a sculptor decide, after a long day, to give a soldier the nose of his uncle, the chin of a neighbor, the scowl of a hated overseer? You suspect the answer is yes, at least some of the time. When forced to repeat a task thousands of times, the human mind seeks refuge in small acts of rebellion, hidden in plain sight. This, you think, is the one place where the silent multitude might actually have a voice. You remember hearing that the army was once painted in brilliant hues, that every face and piece of armor was adorned in color, red lips, black brows, vivid green and blue and purple along the tunics and belts. But now the only color is the gray of fired clay and the dull brown of dust. The silence, it turns out, is mirrored by a kind of visual silence. Every soldier's story has faded, leaving only form and shadow behind. The vibrancy is gone, and with it, any hint that these figures were once intended to be lively, even joyful. You catch sight of one particularly expressive face, a warrior with a slight sardonic smile, his eyes half closed in a look of world weary amusement. You feel an unexpected kinship. Here, surrounded by thousands who will never move or speak, you too feel the weight of things unsaid, the jokes unshared, the fears never given voice. In this army, the silence is not just a symptom of death, it is a design, an aesthetic, a statement of imperial will. The guide, perhaps sensing that the group is becoming too contemplative, interjects with more facts. She explains that some historians believe the faces of the terracotta warriors were inspired by the actual workers who built them. Perhaps, she suggests, the sculptors memorialized themselves and their loved ones in the emperor's army, sneaking their own features into the eternal formation. You consider this a legion of clay soldiers, each one a hidden portrait, a secret claim to remembrance. The emperor tried to fill his afterlife with faceless order, but instead he may have inherited the accidental chaos of human individuality. You notice that even in the silence, there are hints of stories trying to surface. A broken hand clutching at nothing, a scar along a cheek that could be the result of an overzealous chisel, the tilt of a head as if caught in mid conversation with a neighbor, frozen forever at the start of a joke. There is pathos here, and humor, and even a faint whiff of resistance, everything that makes people human, rendered mute by imperial ambition and the passage of time. Your fellow visitors are beginning to drift, bored by the unyielding sameness of row after row of figures. Some snap photos, others yawn or check their phones, perhaps unaware that they are themselves being watched by a congregation of silent witnesses. You think about how strange it is, this reversal. The living become the spectacle, while the dead and the imagined maintain their endless, dignified silence. In a corner, you see a cluster of figures more closely grouped than the rest. Perhaps they were meant to represent a unit, a squad, a cohort, a group of friends assigned to eternal duty together. You imagine what their conversations would sound like if only they were permitted to speak. You imagine what advice they would give you if only the silence could be broken. The guide's voice grows distant, replaced by your own inner monologue. You think about how much of life is spent in silence, not the comforting hush of sleep, but the awkward, anxious kind that accumulates when words are impossible or forbidden. The terracotta army, you realize, is not just a memorial to power or ambition, but a monument to everything that goes unsaid. As you prepare to move on, Yvonne, you feel a strange sense of gratitude for the silence. It is honest, at least. The clay soldiers do not pretend to have all the answers. They do not fill the air with noise or distraction. They wait, patient and uncomplaining, for whatever comes next. Maybe, you think, there is a lesson in that, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful things are the ones left unspoken. You leave the silent thousands behind, stepping back into the flow of the living, and you carry their stillness with you, a small hush tucked inside your thoughts. In a world where everyone is desperate to be heard, there is something oddly comforting about the company of those who have mastered the art of saying nothing at all. You step forward and pause at the edge of the largest excavation pit, an immense yawning chasm in the earth lined with glass and spotlights. It is here that the reality of the terracotta army fully impresses itself upon you, not just as an idea or a rumor, but as an overwhelming, almost claustrophobic spectacle. In the pit below, thousands of soldiers stand in serried rows, packed so closely that from above they appear as a living tide, halted mid advance. The silence here is not just an absence of sound, it is a force, dense and unyielding, pressing against your ears. What you are seeing, the guide informs you, is only a fraction of the whole. Many sections remain unexcavated, left slumbering under the earth out of caution and fear. Some say the scientists have grown superstitious, worried that exposing too much too quickly will trigger the collapse of what time has, against all odds, preserved. Others are simply afraid of damaging what they cannot hope to restore. In this sense, the buried army is still an army, its numbers unknown and its full power only guessed at. The guide, in her patient monotone, repeats the legend. When these warriors were first uncovered in the 1970s, they astonished the world, not only because of their number, but because of their startling color. They were not always the monochrome shades of dust and clay you see now. Their faces were painted, their armor and clothing daubed in wild, improbable colors. Red for life, green for hope, black for power, blue for the afterlife. For a fleeting moment, the underground world must have looked as vibrant as any festival. But almost as soon as the figures met the modern air, the paint began to curl and vanish, stolen by chemistry and sunlight. The army's original splendor was erased in the very act of being witnessed. You peer down at the lines of soldiers. Here and there, you notice the breaks in formation, the missing limbs and shattered torsos. Earthquakes, floods, centuries of pressure and neglect have battered the warriors. Some have been painstakingly reconstructed, a puzzle of fragments glued together by teams of experts working in silence. Others lie where they fell, a jumble of heads, arms, and armor awaiting their eventual resurrection, or perhaps their final disintegration. The emperor's dream was for an army that would never be defeated. But even terracotta cracks and crumbles, even baked clay cannot keep chaos out forever. Your guide explains the scale of the burial project: three main pits, covering an area larger than several football fields, thousands of infantry, officers, archers, chariots, horses, even acrobats and musicians, all entombed as part of the emperor's afterlife bureaucracy. It is an empire in miniature, frozen in the act of defending a man who has been dead for over 2,000 years. You begin to feel a peculiar dizziness, as if the ground beneath your feet has started to move. The sheer size of it is exhausting, a reminder that some fears, when given resources, can become vast beyond all reason. You try to imagine the moment of burial, the night the army was sealed beneath the earth. Was it a ceremony full of ritual and fear? Or was it simply another task for the workers, a job done in the dark with the hope that, this time, nobody would be buried alongside their creation? You can picture the slow, methodical work, shovels of dirt thrown onto painted armor, the final glimpses of vivid color disappearing into shadow, the gradual suffocation of air and light until nothing remained but memory. There is a temptation to romanticize all this, to see it as noble or glorious. But the reality, you suspect, is more mundane and more grim. These soldiers are not heroes or martyrs. They are props in a story about a man too terrified to leave the stage. Their silence, their immobility, is not an act of courage, but of obedience, forced upon them by the relentless demands of imperial ego. A child beside you asks a simple question: why did they bury so many? The guide answers with a fact about the afterlife and the emperor's belief in magic, but you are not satisfied. You think the real answer is that, given absolute power, people rarely know when to stop. The emperor's paranoia became a machine, churning out soldiers until the earth could hold no more. What began as a ritual of protection ended as an act of overkill, a monument not to faith, but to exhaustion. You gaze at the broken pieces, at the warriors who never made it to the parade ground, and wonder if anyone mourned for them. Did the craftsmen pause to pay respects before covering them with earth? Or was it simply relief to be finished, to survive another day? You think of all the hands that shaped these figures, all the eyes that saw their colors fade, and you realize that every army, no matter how eternal, is built from the lives and deaths of the ordinary. The pit feels colder now, as if the ghosts of those who built it are still lingering, trapped between pride and regret. You shift uncomfortably, grateful that you can leave when you choose, that your job does not require you to stand forever in the dark. The soldiers below have no such escape. They are conscripts of eternity, bound to a duty that ended long ago but cannot be revoked. As the tour moves forward, you take one last look back. The buried army remains, silent and half awake, waiting for orders that will never come. You think, immortality, when achieved by force, is just another word for being unable to rest. You find yourself straying near a scale model of the necropolis, arranged behind glass and lit with dramatic shadows. The guide gestures toward the miniature burial mound at the center, and you realize just how much of the Emperor's world was built below ground. There are tunnels and chambers and sloping corridors, a city of the dead that rivals any metropolis above it. As you listen, you realize that the creation of this underworld was an undertaking of almost impossible ambition, a feat that drew workers from every corner of the empire and gave birth to 1,000 rumors, some more unsettling than the rest. The official history is straightforward. The emperor, fearing death, decreed the construction of a tomb that would preserve his power in perpetuity. 700,000 workers, convicts, conscripts, craftsmen, were assembled and set to the monumental task. They dug, they carried, they carved and fired clay, day after day, year after year. Some spent their entire lives beneath the sunless surface, toiling without hope of recognition or reward. The result was a labyrinth so vast that even today, most of it remains unexplored, and the true number of workers is lost to time. But the rumors, you quickly learn, are far more gripping than the official story. The first and most persistent, that when the tomb was completed, those who built it were buried alive to keep its secrets. The logic is chilling, but perversely simple. If no one who knew the way out survived, then no one could betray the Emperor's final refuge. The guide hesitates, perhaps not wanting to frighten the school children in the group, but even she cannot entirely deny the tale. You notice a few visitors look pale, and you wonder how many nightmares the legend has spawned in 2 millennia. You hear whispers about other horrors, underground rivers of mercury meant to mimic real waterways, lethal traps triggered by hidden switches, and poisonous air that seeps from fissures if the wrong chamber is breached. The guide confirms that tests have found unusually high concentrations of mercury in the soil around the burial mound. She raises an eyebrow, as if to suggest that while the truth may not be quite as theatrical as the rumors, it is not so far removed either. You marvel at the mix of engineering and myth making, the way in which one man's paranoia could shape a landscape, and how, centuries later, it continues to shape imaginations. There are other rumors too, less macabre, but just as persistent. Some say the warriors' faces were modeled after real people, the craftsmen themselves, or soldiers in the emperor's own army. Others insist that somewhere deep within the tomb, treasures beyond imagining are hidden, scrolls, gems, even weapons forged with secret techniques now lost to the world. The necropolis, you realize, is as much a creation of rumor as it is of stone and clay. You try to picture the construction in progress, the endless labor, the clatter of tools, the shouting of foremen, the dust that filled every mouth and eye. For the emperor, the tomb was a promise of safety, but for those who built it, it must have seemed like a sentence, a world that grew darker and deeper with every passing day. Did the workers speak of rebellion, or did exhaustion crush all hope? Did they carve secret marks into the walls, or pray for a quick death rather than a lifetime of labor underground? The stories haunt you as you move through a reconstructed tunnel, lined with bricks stamped with ancient marks of quality and origin. Each mark is a signature of sorts, a final trace of someone who probably never expected to be remembered. Perhaps it was an act of pride, or simply a way to keep track of quotas. Perhaps it was a last, desperate attempt to leave something behind, some scrap of individuality in a project designed to erase it. The rumors persist because the tomb itself remains sealed. The burial mound at the heart of the necropolis has never been fully opened. Archaeologists worry about the mercury, about the traps, about the very real risk of destroying what cannot be restored. You sense a peculiar irony. The emperor, in his fear of being disturbed, built a defense so effective that not even his admirers dare to break it. The result is a perpetual state of suspense, a secret always just out of reach, a story without a final chapter. Somewhere in the background, you hear a guide explain to another group that the construction of the tomb required logistical feats unmatched for centuries, canals dug to bring water, kilns burning day and night, a supply chain that spanned the known world. The scale is so absurd that it almost defies comprehension. For every layer of engineering, there is a layer of rumor. For every official record, a dozen whispered tales. You begin to see the necropolis not just as a place of death, but as a monument to uncertainty. It is a maze of stories and silences, facts and fictions, built atop one another until the truth is as buried as the emperor himself. The construction, as much as the tomb, was a project of myth making, an effort to build a legacy that would endure even if the details were lost. As you leave the model behind and rejoin the main path, you feel the weight of all that was left unsaid, all that was concealed. You think about the workers whose labor built not only walls and soldiers, but legends, rumors that would outlive them by centuries. You wonder, as you move on, whether the greatest secret buried here is not the tomb or its treasures, but the knowledge that every monument is a compromise between what we wish to remember and what we are forced to forget. You catch the tail end of another whispered rumor, something about ghosts, about voices heard at night in the tunnels. You smile, realizing that the necropolis is alive in its own way, sustained not just by stone and clay, but by the endless stories spun around it, as persistent and as shadowy as the emperor's own fear of death. It is a strange thing, you realize, to walk for hours in the shadow of a man whose very presence is everywhere and nowhere. You have seen his soldiers, his horses, his chariots. You have wandered his necropolis, listened to the recitation of his obsessions, and traced the edges of his ambition in baked clay and rumor. Yet, for all the evidence of his power, the emperor himself is conspicuously absent. He is the sun around which this silent universe revolves, and yet no one, absolutely no one, has laid eyes on his actual resting place. The guide explains that, despite all the centuries, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang remains sealed. No archaeologist has stood at the threshold of the burial chamber. No camera has peered inside. The emperor's afterlife fortress is still locked tight, protected by earth and elaborate, half legendary defenses. Even now, the mound at the heart of the necropolis is an unbroken dome of loam crowned by grass and rumor. She gestures at a faded illustration, a cutaway of the burial mound imagined by artists and engineers. At its center, a chamber the size of a banquet hall, lined with bronze and stone, encircled by rivers of mercury, protected by crossbow traps and other ingenious devices lost to time. You look at the image and try to picture what it must be like inside. Dark, silent, a world within a world untouched by breath or sunlight for over 2 millennia. There is an odd reverence in the air as she speaks. Even now, no one seems entirely comfortable discussing the idea of opening the tomb. For some, it is a question of science. The technology does not yet exist to excavate without destroying what remains. For others, it is a matter of respect, a feeling that to disturb the emperor's sleep is to invite disaster, or at the very least, bad luck. Superstition and practicality blur together, as they so often do in the presence of the unknown. The guide repeats the standard warnings, the mercury readings, the ancient texts describing deadly traps, the unique soil chemistry that has preserved the tomb this long. You are told that Sima Qian, the great historian, recorded the construction of rivers and seas of flowing metal inside the burial chamber, and that recent scientific surveys have confirmed mercury levels so high that birds will not land on the mound. You imagine the sealed tomb as a kind of time capsule, a pocket of the ancient world waiting to be punctured, at which point, who knows what might escape? It is not lost on you that this impenetrable secrecy is the emperor's last and perhaps greatest victory in life. He ruled by making himself visible everywhere, his image stamped on coins, his laws carved into mountains, his armies parading through every province. In death, he is nowhere to be found, a king who has vanished into legend and uncertainty. You wonder if he would be pleased by this, or if he would rage against the irony that his most enduring legacy is his own absence. You glance around at the tourists, the guides, the researchers. All of you, you realize, are orbiting the emperor's absence, drawn by the gravity of a mystery that refuses to resolve. The entire necropolis is a prelude, a stage set for a play whose main actor has never appeared. The soldiers, the chariots, the walls and tunnels, all are arranged for an audience with a king who will not take his bow. You hear a story, one of many that circulate here, traded in gift shops and whispered by tired custodians. They say a team of archaeologists once lowered a probe into the burial mound and withdrew it, shaken, after their instruments failed and the air inside proved too toxic to breathe. Another rumor claims that the emperor himself ordered the tomb to be cursed, so that any who entered would be struck down. You suspect the truth, as always, is somewhere between engineering and imagination. The dangers are real, but so are the stories people build to justify their hesitation. There is something undeniably theatrical about it. The emperor, invisible and unreachable, has become a kind of ghost, present in every corridor, every exhibit, every shiver of curiosity that runs through the visitors. You feel it yourself, a faint itch at the base of the skull. What would it be like to be the first to see him, to stand in a chamber no living person has entered in over 2,000 years? The question is almost sacrilegious, a trespass into a domain that was never meant to be yours. You realize that the Emperor's invisibility has become his greatest form of control. The unknown is always more powerful than the known. So long as the tomb remains sealed, Qin Shi Huang is more than a man. He is a myth, a story that can never be disproved, a king who remains a king forever. The guides repeat their warnings, the scientists issue their cautious reports, and every year more visitors come to walk the edge of his world, to wonder at a silence that has outlasted empires. You pause at the last overlook, gazing at the burial mound rising from the earth, unbroken and impenetrable. Grass waves atop it, birds circle warily overhead, and beneath your feet, secrets shift in the darkness. The Emperor waits, unseen, at the center of it all, perfectly alone. You think, perhaps that is the most honest ending for anyone who built a world entirely out of fear, an endless solitude, guarded by thousands, disturbed by no one. The tour moves on. You leave the Emperor behind, not quite disappointed, but not satisfied either. There is no revelation, no climactic encounter. There is only the persistent mystery, the unseeable center, the empty throne at the heart of all the spectacle. And you, like everyone else, are left with questions that will never be answered, and the strange comfort of knowing that sometimes history's greatest secret is simply the refusal to be seen. You follow the path that spirals outward from the emperor's unopened tomb, but the questions only grow thicker. The group pauses beneath a faded map depicting the heart of the burial mound, an imagined underworld of rivers, lakes, and palaces. The guide's voice, now softer and almost conspiratorial, turns to one of the strangest and most enduring aspects of the entire necropolis, the rivers of Mercury. You have heard hints already, the warnings, the rumors, the traces of poison in the soil. Now, as the guide recounts the tale, it becomes clear that Mercury is not just a detail, it is a character in the story, equal in weight to the emperor himself. According to the ancient historian Sima Qian, the emperor commanded that rivers and seas of mercury be constructed to flow through his tomb, mimicking the geography of the known world. The metal was to shimmer and swirl in darkness, a moving map for a restless spirit who could not bear to be still. You try to imagine the scene, an immense underground hall, black as pitch, with channels cut into the floor and filled with quicksilver. The air itself would shimmer, heavy with toxic vapor, catching the light of 1,000 lamps reflected from the surface of the liquid metal. It is a vision at once grandiose and grotesque, a fantasy of power, of wealth, of mastery over the elements, but also a monument to fear. The rivers would flow forever, untroubled by time, even as the emperor's bones crumbled to dust. The guide gestures to a display of scientific results, charts and numbers showing abnormally high concentrations of mercury in the earth above the tomb. Okay, researchers, using probes and soil samples, have confirmed that the legends are more than just myth. The mercury is there, lurking in the ground, an invisible moat that still guards the emperor's secrets after more than 2,000 years. It is a chemical curse, a warning to the curious and the reckless. The burial mound, once a symbol of ambition, has become a zone of contamination, a wound in the earth that refuses to heal. You consider the logic behind such a choice. Mercury was a symbol of immortality in ancient China, an elixir said to prolong life, though as the emperor's own fate proved, it did just the opposite. Some scholars believe that Qin Shi Huang's death was hastened by ingesting mercury-based potions in his desperate pursuit of eternal youth. It is an irony so sharp that you almost laugh. The very substance meant to cheat death became a poison that ensured it. In the end, the emperor's afterlife was flooded not by blessings, but by the slow, patient seepage of poison. The guide notes that the rivers of mercury were also a kind of trap. Ancient texts warn of ingenious devices, crossbows rigged to fire on intruders, secret passageways that collapse at a touch, and above all, the ever-present danger of deadly fumes. No one is sure how much of this is true and how much is a tale grown in the telling. What is certain is that no modern excavation has dared to breach the burial chamber. The risks to both artifacts and archaeologists are too great. You glance at a diagram showing the possible layout of the tomb, a central chamber for the emperor, surrounded by smaller rooms for his treasures, his concubines, his favorite servants. All of it sits beneath the threat of mercury, a defense system as impersonal as time itself. Even now, the metal leaks slowly into the soil, its presence recorded in scientific journals and local legends alike. You wonder if anyone ever truly believed that such defenses would be enough, or if they were only meant to buy a few more centuries of secrecy. The group moves on, but you linger at the edge of the mound, staring into the forbidden center. You think about the craftsmen who dug the channels and poured the mercury, about the architects who designed a system so elaborate that it is still feared thousands of years later. Did any of them suspect what they were building? Did they understand that they were not just protecting a king, but also entombing a poison that would outlive them all? Mercury is a fitting legacy, you decide. It is beautiful but deadly, alluring but treacherous, a perfect symbol for a man who was both admired and feared, whose vision of immortality was inseparable from his terror of being forgotten. The emperor's rivers have outlasted his empire. They have become his last line of defense, an invisible barrier that keeps both enemies and admirers at bay. As the guide calls you forward, you take one last look at the mound. The surface is quiet, grass growing in lazy swirls, but beneath your feet, the secret rivers still move, unseen and untouchable. The emperor sleeps in his chamber of poison, and you realize that, in the end, it is not only the living who fear what waits in the darkness. The dead, too, build their barricades, hoping to keep the world at a distance, hoping that something, anything, might last. You walk away, a little more aware of the invisible dangers that shape the past, a little more humbled by the knowledge that history, like Mercury, flows in ways no one can truly control. There is a peculiar atmosphere to grand funerals, the solemnity, the pageantry, the public display of grief. But as you follow the guide through the endless corridors of the necropolis, you begin to understand that what happened here was something entirely different. This was not a funeral in any human sense. It was a production, a performance for eternity, staged on a scale so monstrous that it no longer feels personal at all. You try to imagine the actual event, the day, or more likely the weeks, when the world's first emperor was finally laid to rest. It would not have been quiet nor gentle. There would have been banners and gongs, priests and soldiers, weeping ministers, and perhaps a smattering of genuine tears lost among the required displays of loyalty. Thousands of attendants must have moved in precise, rehearsed formation, each assigned a specific role in the choreography of departure. It is almost comic, you think, how much effort went into making sure that death looked like victory. The guide recounts the logistics. The body of Qin Shi Huang would have been placed in his final chamber, accompanied by a retinue more elaborate than anything even the greatest generals could command in life. The emperor's favorite concubines and servants, at least those unlucky enough to have been chosen, were sent into the tomb with him, some willingly, most not. Their stories end where his does, with no lines in the histories, no names carved into stone, just a footnote to someone else's immortality. You hear, with a kind of numb horror, that as many as several thousand people may have been buried alive to keep the emperor company and to ensure the secrets of the tomb would not escape. In a world where everything was about control, even the dead had to serve. It is a fact delivered so flatly by the guide, so wrapped in the softest of euphemisms, that you almost miss its cruelty. Only later does it dawn on you that a funeral of this size is less a celebration of a life than a demonstration of absolute power. You picture the scene, a vast trench filled with officials, musicians, dancers, animals, all arranged in their designated places. Even the afterlife had a seating chart, you realize. The emperor's tomb was his final court, and there would be no disorder, no surprises. Anyone who witnessed the construction, who knew the secrets of the defenses or the rivers of Mercury, was to join the emperor in silence as insurance against the living. It is not grief that animates this scene, but fear, a fear so great it required the sacrifice of hundreds, if not thousands, to placate. The emperor's family, of course, was exempt from such fates. They watched from above as the tomb was sealed, as the necropolis was filled with the last sounds of life. You wonder whether they mourned or whether they simply calculated, counting days and enemies, weighing risks, already jostling for power, in a world suddenly emptied of its central figure. For most people, funerals are a time to reckon with loss. Here, it was only an opportunity to recalculate alliances. The guide, perhaps feeling the weight in the room, turns your attention to the architectural marvels. She describes how the burial complex was built on a grid, like a city in miniature. There were storehouses filled with food, armories stocked with weapons, stables with clay horses, kitchens and workshops, all rendered useless by the simple fact that they were meant for the dead. The emperor could not take it with him, but he could make sure no one else used it. You notice that most visitors avoid the darker details, choosing instead to marvel at the scale, the beauty, the sheer improbability of so much effort aimed at a single man's fear of being forgotten. They snap photos, buy souvenirs, and listen politely, as if acknowledging that the price of such a spectacle should not be dwelled upon. You find yourself complicit in this, drifting from tragedy to spectacle, numbed by the numbers until the humanity of it all fades into the background noise of history. There's a moment when you glimpse a reconstructed tableau, a handful of clay figures gathered around a model coffin, heads bowed in eternal mourning. It is meant to be solemn, but it feels theatrical, less an act of remembrance than an exercise in imperial propaganda. Even the gestures of grief have been choreographed, frozen in place like the rest of the army, doomed to repeat their roles until the tomb itself collapses. You realize that the emperor's funeral was designed to be seen, even if only by the dead and by the ghosts of the future. Every element was a message, a declaration of power, a warning to rivals, a plea to the heavens. It was not enough for the emperor to be buried with his soldiers and servants. The entire world had to know that death had not diminished him. The performance had to continue even as the curtain fell. As you leave this section of the necropolis, you feel a strange exhaustion. You have walked through the afterlife and found it crowded, overbearing, and strangely empty. The scale of the funeral has become its own kind of silence, a silence so vast that it erases the voices of everyone except the one man at its center. You think, not for the first time, that immortality looks suspiciously like loneliness, and that the greatest achievement of Qin Shi Huang's burial was to make the whole world stand still for a moment, just to watch him disappear. You find yourself herded toward another dimly lit hall, this one more like a laboratory than a mausoleum. Here, the necropolis reveals itself as something other than a graveyard. It is also an archive of lost inventions, a monument to the emperor's deep seated faith in technology, bureaucracy, and the promise that cleverness could stave off oblivion. The guide, her voice reverberating off vitrines and display cases, introduces you to the marvels of imperial engineering. The terracotta army was not just an artistic or spiritual project, it was a technological one. The emperor, who standardized weights, measures, and currency across his vast realm, applied the same logic of systems and scale to his own death. The clay soldiers themselves, the guide explains, are not just impressive for their number, but for their construction. Legs were cast in molds, torsos rolled from coils, heads individually sculpted for an illusion of uniqueness. Assembly lines, if not in name, then in method, rippled through the workshops, overseen by engineers whose titles have long since been lost to history. You pause before a display of crossbow bolts. The guide lifts one up reverently and describes how the emperor's craftsmen developed spring mechanisms and trigger systems so advanced that no similar technology appeared in Europe until centuries later. There were once thousands of crossbows in the pits, many booby-trapped and rigged to fire at any would-be tomb robbers. The ancient texts, you are told, speak of automatic defenses, a network of levers, pulleys, and hidden switches that could unleash a barrage of bolts on anyone unwise enough to disturb the sleeping emperor. It is equal parts impressive and ridiculous, a paranoia that spurred innovation. The emperor's obsession with security, taken to its logical extreme, led to an arsenal of machines designed to operate without supervision for centuries. The line between genius and madness blurs, and you begin to suspect that the greatest inventions are often motivated by fear rather than hope. The guide shows you other innovations, remnants of bronze swords, their edges still sharp thanks to a thin layer of chromium oxide, a process not understood or replicated for millennia. You are told that even the arrowheads were mass produced with precision molds, and that the wheels of the model chariots were assembled from parts that could be swapped out like spare tires. The burial complex was, in some ways, the testing ground for the technologies of an empire, many developed for war, now retired to the realm of the dead. You look at a diorama reconstructing one of the underground stables. The chariots were parked in neat rows, horses fitted with clay harnesses, and grooms cast forever in the act of preparing for a journey that will never begin. The emperor, it seems, was determined to enter the next world as prepared as he had been in this one. It is both admirable and deeply unsettling, an afterlife that resembles an eternal military parade. The guide, perhaps eager to break the tension, tells you about the vast drainage systems that kept the tomb dry for centuries, the layers of stone and clay designed to resist intrusion from both thieves and the elements. There were even artificial mountains, rivers, and lakes constructed to mirror the real world, all mapped and engineered with meticulous detail. It is a strange sort of comfort, you think, to believe that if you only build enough layers of protection, you can outwit time itself. But the darker side of all this ingenuity is never far away. You recall the rumors of mercury rivers, the stories of trapped passageways and hidden weapons. Technology, in the hands of the terrified, becomes a kind of trap. Every innovation is a new means of sealing the door tighter, of isolating the self from the world, both in life and in death. As you walk, you notice that the displays alternate between celebration and caution. One exhibit lauds the complexity of the emperor's locks and traps. Another quietly notes that, in the end, none of it stopped the slow intrusion of time, thieves, and curiosity. The chariots rusted, the weapons were plundered, the clay soldiers lost their color. All that remains now is the shell of ingenuity, a glimpse of what happens when technology serves not progress, but paranoia. You linger before a case containing a fragment of bronze sword, still gleaming faintly in the artificial light. The label boasts of the chemical genius that kept it sharp, but you know that no weapon, however advanced, could ever win the war against silence. The swords and crossbows are museum pieces, their cleverness turned into footnotes. In a final ironic twist, the Emperor's defenses, designed to keep the living out, have preserved his legacy for the living to study. The locks, the weapons, the clever drains and traps, all are now catalogued, measured, and photographed by the descendants of those who once feared them. What was once intended as a barrier has become a bridge between the past and the present. As the group moves on, you reflect on the idea that every empire is an engineering project, an attempt to solve the problem of mortality with new tools and stricter protocols. But, as the Emperor's tomb quietly testifies, technology is no match for entropy. The more elaborate the defenses, the more poignant their eventual failure. In the end, the greatest invention of all is the ability to let go. You leave the hall of imperial technologies behind, the weight of cleverness pressing down on your thoughts. The Emperor's army, his machines, his river of mercury, they all whisper the same message. Nothing lasts forever, not even ingenuity. And perhaps you think that is the only technology worth trusting. You drift onward, leaving behind the parade of imperial gadgets and traps, only to find yourself amid another tableau. The archaeologists. They are not present in the flesh, but their legacy is everywhere. Photographs on the walls, rows of field notebooks behind glass, sepia toned images of men in khaki squinting into the sun or peering anxiously at fragments of painted clay. In this section, the story turns from the Emperor's desire for immortality to the modern world's hunger for discovery. You realize, somewhat gloomily, that both hungers are rarely satisfied. It began, the guide recounts, with a simple act of digging. In the spring of the year 1974, local farmers, searching not for history, but for water, struck something hard in the soil. Instead of a new well, they found a fragment of a warrior's face, staring up at them with that same stoic expression now shared by thousands. Word traveled quickly, and soon the quiet fields outside Xi'an were overrun with scientists, journalists, and government officials, all eager for a piece of the past. You sense the initial thrill in the early accounts, the hope of finding treasure, the expectation of revelation, the certainty that the earth still held secrets worth knowing. There was excitement in every photograph, every breathless report from the site. At first, each shovelful of earth uncovered something wondrous. A whole battalion here, a line of chariots there, rows of archers with painted faces frozen mid-turn. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tomb might yield all its secrets to the patient and the clever. But as the work continued, disappointment crept in. The paint flaked off the moment it met the air, vanishing before cameras could even focus. The delicate arrangement of soldiers, so perfect underground, collapsed into chaos once exposed. Thousands of weapons had already been stolen or corroded away, and the greatest prize of all, the Emperor's own chamber, remained stubbornly out of reach, buried beneath layers of earth and mercury. What had looked at first like the world's greatest time capsule revealed itself to be something messier, more fragile, and ultimately more enigmatic than anyone had hoped. You listen as the guide describes the decades since that first dig. Teams from around the world have taken turns with the pits, each new technology promising to solve the site once and for all. There were hopes pinned on ground penetrating radar, on chemical analysis, on 3D scanning, but every triumph comes with a caveat: a statue reconstructed, a fragment preserved, and still the central tomb remains impenetrable. The tools improve, but the mysteries deepen. Some of the archaeologists' efforts have only made things worse. Experiments with new preservation chemicals left streaks and stains on the ancient clay. Early attempts to remove and reassemble shattered warriors resulted in unintentional modern mosaics: a hand from one figure, the head from another, a torso that never belonged. The drive to reconstruct, to display, to possess has sometimes come at the cost of authenticity. The emperor built his legacy to be eternal, but time, humidity, and human curiosity conspire to reduce even the grandest vision to a field of fragments. You gaze at a glass case where the head and arm of a warrior sit, separate from the rest of his body. The plaque reads, "Awaiting restoration." You think of all the things in life left and incomplete, all the dreams that crumble at the touch of daylight. The past, you realize, does not yield its meaning willingly. It resists explanation, offers only half truths and unanswered questions, and laughs quietly at the persistence of those who would try to make it whole. There are bright spots, of course. Each new layer of excavation reveals unexpected finds: bronze birds, acrobats, rare weapons, and the occasional glimpse of pigment still clinging stubbornly to a belt or boot. There are stories of breakthroughs and small victories, of teams working for years to reassemble a single statue or decipher an ancient inscription. The guide seems to take pride in these, but you sense the underlying frustration. For every solved puzzle, 100 more appear. You overhear visitors murmuring about the decision not to open the central tomb. Some argue for patience, for waiting until science can guarantee preservation. Others whisper that perhaps it should never be opened, that its secrets are best left intact, protected by the same silence and mystery the emperor imposed. You realize that even among the living, the tomb continues to divide, to inspire hope and anxiety in equal measure. At the exit of the excavation hall, you pause to read a wall covered in quotes from archaeologists, historians, and poets. One stands out: "We dig for answers, but the earth gives only stories." You smile, recognizing the truth in it. The emperor wanted certainty, control, power, immortality. The archaeologists want clarity, facts, and closure. What both find is disappointment, the stubborn, beautiful ambiguity of history, refusing to let itself be tamed. You step outside, blinking in the daylight, feeling a little smaller and a little wiser. The necropolis, for all its grandeur, is a place of unanswered questions. Its treasures are incomplete, its soldiers are scarred, and its greatest secret remains just beyond reach. You think, perhaps, that is the way it should be. The past should remain just mysterious enough to keep us humble, to remind us that for all our digging, some mysteries are content to wait a little longer. By now, you are far enough into the necropolis that you have begun to lose track of time. The world outside, the one with cell phones, deadlines, and coffee shops, feels almost as distant as the era of the emperor himself. Here, among thousands of silent soldiers and the relentless hush of the underground, your sense of reality begins to shift. There is a peculiar power in presence, a weight to being surrounded by the past that no textbook or screen can truly replicate. You stand at the edge of another pit, watching the slow choreography of other visitors. The careful steps, the craned necks, the shared hush that seems to settle over even the most restless children. The air feels heavier here, thick with the accumulation of centuries. You notice how even the most skeptical members of your group have fallen silent, transfixed by the sight of so many lifeless faces turned eternally forward. There is something about standing among an army that has outlasted every war, every king, every storm and revolution that renders even the living reverent. The guide invites you closer, urging you to notice the subtle variations in posture and gesture, how one archer seems to lean ever so slightly into his bow, while another officer stands with his hand resting on a sword that is no longer there. You try to take it in, but what strikes you most is not the individuality, but the collective effect. 8,000 statues, each unique, each part of a greater whole, each contributing to the quiet pressure of their combined gaze. You are not just a visitor here. You are an intruder, a ripple of the present disturbing the still surface of ancient time. You look around and realize that the effect is not unlike being in a cathedral, an overwhelming sense of scale and purpose that shrinks your ego down to manageable size. In this place, the concerns of daily life feel embarrassingly small. No one here remembers your name, your ambitions, your disappointments. All that matters is the weight of presence, the echo of a world that was built to last, and somehow has. There is, you discover, a strange kind of comfort in being small. The emperor, for all his power and paranoia, feared exactly the opposite: to be diminished, to be forgotten, to be made irrelevant by the passage of years. Yet standing here, dwarfed by clay and history, you realize that insignificance is not the worst fate. There is relief in letting go of the need to matter absolutely. The past, it turns out, is a good place to learn humility. The guide, perhaps sensing the mood, shares a story about a visiting scholar who wept openly upon seeing the army for the first time. It was not grief, she explains, but awe, a confrontation with something so vast, so persistent, that it reminded him of his own fleetingness. You look around and see the same emotion flickering in the faces of your fellow travelers. The young woman blinking back tears, the old man who leans a little heavier on his cane, the child whose usual restlessness has been stilled by the sheer strangeness of it all. You realize that presence works both ways. You are shaped by this place, but you also shape it by being here. Every footstep, every whispered comment, every silent question is another layer added to the tomb's long history. You wonder what the terracotta warriors would make of you, a visitor from an unimaginable future, pausing to marvel at their eternal vigil. You suspect they would not be impressed. Their presence is enough. They have no need to perform, to justify, to explain. They simply are. You linger for a while, letting the silence fill you. You notice how the dust seems to hang in the air, catching the light and turning every breath into a tiny act of communion with the past. You think about all the others who have stood where you stand, emperors and peasants, generals and poets, tourists and archaeologists, all of them changed, if only a little, by the effect of presence. There is an irony here, of course. The emperor built his necropolis to make himself eternal, to ensure that his presence would never be forgotten. Yet what survives, most of all, is the presence of those who served him, the nameless soldiers, the faceless workers, the endless ranks of the ordinary and the overlooked. Their collective presence, multiplied by the thousands, is what stuns and silences the visitor. The emperor's legacy is not his own face, but the effect he has on everyone who comes after. As the group prepares to move on, you take one last look at the sea of warriors, their eyes fixed on some distant point you cannot see. You wonder what it means to be truly present, to endure not through ambition or conquest, but through quiet persistence, through being part of something larger than yourself. The lesson, if there is one, seems simple. We are all, in the end, only as immortal as the effect we have on those who come to stand in our shadow. You step away, lighter now, the burden of self importance slipping off your shoulders. The past has pressed itself into you, and you suspect it will linger long after you return to the surface, back to the clamor of the living world. It is only after hours spent among the endless rows of silent warriors that the most obvious contrast begins to haunt you. For all the grand talk of immortality, what you see before you are the unmistakable signs of mortality: cracks in the clay, faded paint, a hand broken off and propped up beside its former arm like an afterthought. The soldiers remain, but their perfection does not. Time, you realize, is an artist every bit as persistent as the emperor's craftsman, and far less forgiving. The guide, perhaps unintentionally, gives voice to the paradox. She notes how the emperor's project was driven by a longing for immortality, not just for himself, but for his entire vision of empire. Yet, standing here, you cannot help but notice that everything he built has become a monument to the fleeting nature of all things. It is the mortals, The workers, the soldiers, the anonymous thousands whose likenesses endure. The emperor's face, by contrast, remains absent, lost to history and rumor. You think of the men who sculpted the warriors, how they must have labored for years in the shadows of the great burial mound. Some, perhaps, believed in the emperor's dream of eternal protection. Others, you suspect, simply tried to survive, carving a little of themselves into the clay when no one was looking. They are long gone, but their handiwork persists, more persistent than any law, any edict, any royal proclamation. The irony is complete. The emperor, in seeking immortality, gave it instead to the ordinary, the replaceable, the forgotten. You wonder, not for the first time, what immortality really means. Is it to be remembered by name, or is it enough to have left a mark, however small? The guide recounts how, over centuries, peasants and scholars alike have invented stories about the warriors, that they were modeled after real people, that their features were copied from the workers themselves, that their presence keeps the emperor's restless spirit at bay. Myths pile up atop facts, and in the end, it becomes difficult to say which is more enduring. The soldiers themselves, standing in their rigid rows, seem caught in a paradox. They are immortal in the sense that they have survived 2,000 years, but mortal in every other way, vulnerable to humidity, earthquake, theft, and the slow erosion of meaning that comes with being looked at for too long. Each new discovery brings fresh headlines, but also another reminder that nothing, not even the emperor's army, is truly permanent. The statues are patched, propped, and carefully restored, but they are no longer quite what they once were. Every act of preservation is also an act of change. You recall the legend that some of the workers who built the necropolis were buried alive, entombed so that they could never reveal its secrets. It is a chilling story, one that underscores the fundamental loneliness at the heart of all imperial ambition. Immortality, it turns out, can be a solitary fate. The emperor, protected by thousands, has become the most isolated figure in history, a king without a court, a general without a living army, a spirit trapped at the center of his own design. Around you, the tourists move on, eager for their next photo, their next fact. But you linger, struck by the overwhelming sense that the difference between the mortal and the immortal is not as clear cut as you once thought. The emperor, for all his might, has left behind nothing but echoes and shadows. The workers, for all their anonymity, have achieved a kind of stubborn persistence. Their hands shaped the clay, their faces stare back at you through the centuries. They are gone, but not gone. Mortal, but not erased. You consider your own place in this procession of the living and the dead. Your body will fail. Your name will fade. Your ambitions will be forgotten by all but a handful of people, if that. Yet perhaps that is enough. Perhaps to be truly immortal is not to endure unchanged, but to be remembered in fragments, half remembered gestures, and faint smiles. pass down through time like the soft impressions of a thumb on wet clay. The guide gathers the group for one final look at the army. She asks, almost as a joke, whether anyone would choose to be immortal given the choice. There is an awkward silence. A few people laugh, most, you suspect, are not so sure. It is not hard to see the cost of eternal life. Eternity spent standing guard over nothing, with only the dust for company. As you make your way to the exit, you take one last look at the ranks of warriors. They do not move, they do not age, but they are not quite the same as they once were. The years have softened their lines, dulled their colors, broken and mended their limbs. They are both permanent and impermanent, like all things that matter. You step out into the late afternoon, blinking at the light, the hush of the tomb still ringing in your ears. In the end, you decide perhaps there is no difference at all between the mortal and the immortal, only the stories we tell and the time we have to tell them. There is a particular chill that settles in as the tour winds deeper into the necropolis, a cold that is less about temperature and more about the realization of just how far a single dream can stretch and how heavy the consequences of that dream can become. You walk through the shadow of the emperor's ambition and begin to understand that his legacy is not simply the clay army or the sealed tomb, but the scale of his longing to be remembered, to be obeyed, to be feared, to live forever through the very act of refusing to let go. The guide leads you to a quiet alcove where a fragment of an imperial edict is displayed behind thick glass. It is a brittle thing, its characters faded and half erased. It speaks in the old formal register of command. This is how you are to build. This is how you are to serve. This is how you are to remember. You notice that the edict, like the tomb, is not about the future, but about the fear of being left behind. The emperor's dream of grandeur was not a vision of hope, but a reaction to the anxiety that haunts all mortals, the dread that time will sweep everything away. The guide's voice grows softer as she explains the many ways Qin Shi Huang tried to hold back oblivion. He remade the world in his own image, unified scripts and weights, abolished rival fiefdoms, destroyed books that did not fit his vision. His projects spanned the land, roads and canals, fortifications, and the first Great Wall, each stone and brick a physical extension of his will. He was a builder of barriers against enemies, against chaos, against the erasure of memory. It is both admirable and appalling, the way his dreams consumed not only his own life, but the lives and futures of countless others. You look at the terracotta army again and realize that it is not simply an afterlife protection detail, but a monument to the seductive power of dreams unchecked by reality. The emperor's vision was so enormous, so absolute, that no individual mattered except as part of the machinery of his immortality. In this way, his dream became a kind of nightmare, a logic that demanded endless sacrifice of labor, of resources, of individual dreams in the service of one man's terror of being forgotten. The guide points out that the emperor's search for immortality led him down ever darker paths. He consulted magicians, alchemists, and charlatans who promised secret formulas and deathless elixirs. His court became a laboratory for potions, many of them laced with mercury and arsenic. There are stories, almost certainly true, that the very medicines meant to prolong his life hastened his death, their toxins warping mind and body. You can almost picture it, the world's most powerful man, surrounded by a swirl of hopeful faces and fraudulent recipes, swallowing poison out of sheer desperation to outwit what cannot be outwitted. It is a grand irony, but a fitting one. The greatest dreamers are often their own worst enemies. The emperor's pursuit of grandeur led him to build the most elaborate mausoleum in history, only to seal himself inside, surrounded by thousands who could never leave. In chasing the promise of eternity, he trapped himself in a prison of his own making. You wonder, as you listen to the guide describe the final years of his reign, whether the emperor ever slept soundly. Did he gaze out at the monuments he had raised and feel triumph, or only the hollow ache of dissatisfaction? Did the completion of the tomb bring peace, or simply a new layer of anxiety? An awareness that even the most magnificent structures are only temporary victories over the darkness. As the tour continues, you notice that the grandeur of the necropolis is inseparable from its futility. For all the effort, for all the human cost, the clay warriors stand guard over dust, the rivers of mercury pool in darkness, and the emperor himself is nowhere to be found. The monuments endure, but the man who built them has vanished, leaving only his absence as the true measure of his ambition. You realize that dreams of grandeur are not unique to emperors. You see them everywhere, in politicians who seek legacy, in artists who chase perfection, in ordinary people who hoard memories or chase milestones, desperate for some mark of permanence in a world that is always changing. There is nothing inherently wrong with these dreams, but they come with a price, a trade off between what is possible and what is lost in the attempt to make the impossible real. Your footsteps echo in the quiet halls, and you imagine the workers who built this place, their own dreams lost beneath the weight of imperial command. What did they hope for as they shaped the soldiers and dug the tunnels? Did they believe that grandeur was worth the price? Did they dream, even secretly, of a world where memory was not enforced by fear, but shared out of love or wonder? You pause in front of a row of half-restored figures. Their faces are serene, indifferent to the ambitions that placed them here. You think that, in the end, the greatest irony is this: the emperor's dream of grandeur has become a lesson in humility. No matter how high the walls, how deep the tomb, or how numerous the guardians, time reclaims everything. The grandeur lingers as shadow and memory, a warning more than a promise. As you follow the group toward the exit, you catch one last glimpse of the silent army. You understand now that what endures is not the emperor's glory, but the quiet testimony of everyone who was swept along by his dreams. In their faces, you see the real legacy, a reminder that every monument, no matter how grand, is built on the foundation of ordinary lives, and that the greatest dreams, unchecked, can become the very thing we fear most. You linger, almost alone now, as the last of the tour group drifts onward. There is a certain silence that comes with the end of an experience, a lull that invites reflection rather than action. You take one final slow circuit of the largest pit, walking the edge as if circling a sleeping giant. All around you, the terracotta army stands exactly as before, unchanged, unblinking, unimpressed by your presence. Yet for the first time, you find yourself drawn not to the grandeur, but to the smallness of individual dreams among this sea of clay. You stop before a single figure near the edge, a foot soldier with a slight chip in his left ear and a look of perpetual concern on his otherwise expressionless face. You wonder who he was meant to represent. Was his face modeled after a real man, perhaps a young conscript dragged from a distant village, or an aging artisan desperate to finish one last task before nightfall? Did the craftsman who sculpted him try, for a moment, to imagine his story, or was he just another piece in a quota, a face in a crowd, shaped by tired hands and imperial decree? For a moment, you imagine the soldier's last day before burial, the dust swirling, the pit filling, the hurried shuffle of feet as workers covered the painted ranks with earth. Did anyone pause to say goodbye to the men and women they had shaped, or to the dreams they had pressed, however faintly, into the clay? Or did exhaustion and fear drown out every last sentimental thought? It is a question with no answer, and yet, standing here, you feel the echo of thousands of forgotten dreams lingering in the still air. You notice other details: a broken sandal, a thumb smudged beyond recognition, a warrior leaning almost imperceptibly toward his neighbor, as if caught mid whisper. These are not the signs of imperial power, but of the quiet humanity that seeps through even the strictest regime. You realize that for every soldier cast in perfect formation, there is a flicker of individuality, an act of quiet rebellion or careless accident. In these small imperfections, the dead speak, not in the thunder of conquest, but in the fragile, persistent language of dreams. The guide, now reduced to a distant voice, reminds the remaining visitors that the army was buried to protect the emperor from the chaos of the afterlife. You think about this idea, a world so frightening that even the dead need armies to guard them. It is a dream that says as much about fear as it does about hope, a vision in which safety can only be bought at the price of endless vigilance. You wonder how many of the workers believed it, and how many dreamed instead of a simpler peace. For a moment, you imagine trading places with one of the terracotta soldiers. You picture yourself standing for eternity, surrounded by neighbors who never move, never speak, never break ranks. Would you find comfort in the order, or would the silence drive you mad? Would you invent dreams to fill the endless hours, stories to pass the time, jokes and memories and hopes, all playing out behind an unmoving mask? Perhaps you think the real afterlife is not what the emperor imagines, but the quiet persistence of small dreams refusing to be erased. You recall something the guide said early in the tour, that many archaeologists believe the craftsmen left hidden marks on their creations, a symbol pressed into the foot, a tiny signature beneath the sleeve, a carved phrase only visible in the right light, acts of quiet defiance or of hope, proof that even in the shadow of empire, people dream of being seen, even if only by accident, centuries later. It comforts you, this idea, that immortality might be found not in grand monuments, but in the unnoticed details, the fingerprints left for strangers to find. You take a last look at the assembled warriors and realize how strange it is to be both witness and participant in this dreamscape. You are here, but you are also the object of their collective gaze, a living echo in a hall of silent watchers. You are part of the story now, just as much as the tourists who came before you and those who will follow. The emperor's dream was to be remembered. The workers' dreams, perhaps, were simply to endure in some small way. Both have succeeded, and both have failed. As you move toward the exit, the world outside begins to intrude again. The hum of distant conversation, the shuffle of feet, the hint of fresh air. Yet you carry something with you, the weight of all those dreams, great and small, woven together in clay and silence. You find yourself hoping that, in some distant future, someone will pause to wonder about your own small place in the world, the marks you left, the dreams you nurtured, the stories that did not make it into the history books. The emperor believed that dreams of stone and earth could last forever. But standing here, at the end of your journey, you suspect it is the fragile dreams, the unfinished, the imperfect, the quietly persistent, that have the best chance of surviving the long march of time. You step into the twilight, leaving the terracotta soldiers behind, their dreams mingling with your own in the slow hush that settles over the ancient earth. History, you realize, is not the story of emperors alone, but of everyone who dared to dream in their shadow. You emerge from the labyrinth of earth and memory and find yourself standing once more beneath the indifferent sky. The air feels fresher, brighter, yet tinged with the same silence you've carried out from underground. There are other visitors now, voices raised and falling, but you move through them like a shadow, carrying with you the weight of everything you have seen and everything you will not quite remember the same way ever again. It is a curious sensation, leaving a place that was never meant to be found, a city of the dead built by hands that never signed their names. You pause at the edge of the mound, gazing back one last time at the grass that hides centuries of fear, longing, and ambition. The world has changed beyond recognition since the emperor's day, but his echo lingers, muffled and fading, barely audible above the hum of the living. You recall, with something like amusement, how the emperor's architects once calculated for every contingency: rivers of mercury, armies of clay, traps set for thieves and time itself. Yet for all their plans, nothing could halt the slow retreat of memory. You think of the tourists clutching maps and souvenirs, eager to share what they have seen before the details begin to blur. You wonder how many stories will be passed on, how many will be lost. Perhaps, you reflect, all grand echoes eventually fade into background noise, softened and altered until only the shape of the story remains. As you wander toward the exit, you hear a child ask, "Who was the emperor?" The parent hesitates, then answers with the briefest summary: a king, a builder, someone who wanted to live forever. The answer hangs in the air for a moment. Simple, insufficient, yet not entirely wrong. You smile, thinking that history has a way of compressing the grandest lives into a handful of vague phrases, leaving the details to decay quietly in the shadow of the present. You consider all that you have learned, the facts, the rumors, the silences between them. The Emperor is everywhere here and nowhere at all. His army, intended as the most steadfast of guardians, is now a spectacle for crowds and cameras. His face is lost to time. His name, for all its former terror, is now more curiosity than warning. The echo of his ambition has not vanished, not yet, but it has changed. It is softer, tinged with irony, barely holding on. There is a kind of peace in this. The guide, in her practiced monotone, speaks of preservation and legacy, but you suspect she knows as well as you do that nothing can truly be preserved, not in the way the emperor dreamed. The painted warriors have lost their color, the weapons are mostly gone. The tomb, sealed and silent, will one day surrender its secrets to time, not to conquest, not to science, but to the slow seep of forgetting. Even the rivers of mercury will settle and sink, their poison diluted, their meaning eroded by generations that care less and less for ancient fears. You wonder, as you join the slow procession of departing visitors, what will endure from your own time? Will the skyscrapers and monuments stand as long as these clay soldiers? Will anyone remember the faces behind the crowds, the names beneath the headlines, the small dreams and fears that fill ordinary lives? Or will your own echo fade just as surely, leaving behind only questions, fragments, the outlines of stories that no one will ever finish telling? It is a strange comfort, this knowledge. The emperor's tragedy, you realize, is not that he was forgotten, but that he could never have been remembered in the way he wished. Memory is not a monument, but an echo. It changes as it travels, softening, distorting, sometimes disappearing altogether. And yet, the echo is enough. It is proof that something once existed, that it mattered to someone, if only for a while. You look back once more at the site, where the earth is still, the air quiet, the presence of the past lingering just at the edge of hearing. The terracotta army remains, not as guards for a vanished ruler, but as witnesses for the persistence of human longing, the need to endure, to be seen, to be remembered, even as the centuries roll on. As you walk away, you feel the fading echo settling gently behind you, a whisper of clay, dust, and silence, at once the end of a story and the beginning of another. The emperor's legacy is not the army or the tomb or the river of Mercury. It is the simple, inescapable truth that nothing lasts forever, and that the greatest dreams leave behind, in the end, only echoes, soft, persistent, fading slowly in the darkness, until all that remains is the hush and the chance for someone else to listen, if only for a moment, before they, too, pass on.